I invite you to help me out. I want to give you a quick quiz on some of the names of the most famous people in our generation. So I'll give you a quick description, and we can just all together at once shout out the name of the person that's being described. So let's start out with the Prime Minister of Canada. All right, how about the winner of the 2003 Oscar for Best Actor is... All right. Some of you, I know, will know this one. As of July 1st of this year, the new president of Harvard University. All right, let's go to sports. The most valuable player in last year's World Series. Everybody together. One more. Who is it? You've got it. Good. %70 is passing. All right, one last one for you musicians. The highest paid American opera singer is... Pavarotti is dead in Italian. Okay, I'll admit to you that I would flunk this test because most of us are unfamiliar with the names of the most famous and powerful people in the world. And most of us are not famous. Now, not to diminish anybody's importance here, but just let me explain that there are billions and billions of people in this world who have never heard of one of us and never will hear of one of us. Our names will be completely unfamiliar to billions of people in our lifetime. Not that being famous is always a good thing. Actually, being famous is sometimes a very bad thing. Most of us will never be famous, but we can still make a lot of difference in our generation, and especially a lot of difference for Jesus Christ. That is why there are 9 names of men in a relatively obscure part of the Bible. 2 of those 9 names are familiar to many. One of them because our capital of Minnesota is named after him, and the other because it is the more common name of Timothy. But the other 7 are really obscure names, pretty much like most of us, ordinary people who were called to make a difference in their own generation. But before going to these names, let's sort of catch up on the story. Nearly 30 years had passed since Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead. And in those 30 years, his message went across the Roman Empire until there were tens of thousands of followers of the way of Jesus, who gathered together in a string of churches across the empire where they learned together and grew together and fellowshiped together and lived out their Christian faith. Controversy and Christianity seemed to continually go hand in hand. Sometimes it was interpersonal and familial disputes, but sometimes it rose to the level of a riot, and that is what happened in the Asian city of Ephesus. It was such a riot that it became time for St. Paul and his colleagues to get out of the city, and that's where we pick up the story. When the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. He traveled through that area, speaking many words of encouragement to the people, and finally arrived in Greece, where he stayed 3 months. Because the Jews made a plot against him just as he was about to sail for Syria, he decided to go back through Macedonia. He was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus, from Berea, Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, Timothy also, and Tychicus and Trophimus from the province of Asia. These men went on ahead and waited for us at Troas. But we sailed from Philippi after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. Now, on the face of it, this is one boring section of names and very ordinary travel. Although, interestingly, it covers a period of about an entire year in the history of the New Testament church. It's because we are interested in the Bible that we take a somewhat deeper look. Paul was in Ephesus, in the province and the continent of Asia. He decided to leave there and go to Macedonia on a global scale that wasn't very far across the Aegean Sea, but it was from one continent of Asia to the next continent of Europe. Macedonia was the northern part of Greece. Paul had previously been there and established churches in that area. His return to Macedonia had a twofold purpose. One was to encourage and grow the churches that were already established, and the other was to raise money. So this was a fundraising trip. He was seeking to raise money from each of the newly established churches to help out poor people, and specifically poor Christians who live back in Jerusalem. From Macedonia in the north, he continued his travels to Greece in the south, again, to build up churches and to raise money for the poor. When the money had been raised, he intended to take it to Jerusalem by way of Syria, going back to Syria because his home church was in Antioch and he periodically reported there. And he decided to buy a ticket with a tour group going to Israel. Now, you may think, we may think that tours to Israel are actually sort of a 20th and 21st century phenomenon. But actually, that's not the case. There were lots of tour groups to Israel in the first century. There were tour organizers, and they would charter an entire ship that would take them to visit Israel. Because Jews were dispersed across the empire, and they did what Jews around the world today do at Passover. And that is, universally, in the celebration of Passover, it always ends with the same statement: next year in Jerusalem. And so those who took that commitment seriously would buy into these chartered ships to go to Israel. And that's what Paul did, to take the money to those poor Christians that were in Jerusalem. Except he heard about a conspiracy against him, because there were in the synagogues those who had enormous antipathy toward Paul. They resented his message. They resented the recruitment of members out of the synagogue into new churches. And as there often are in all kinds of political and religious groups, fringe part that is terroristic and fanatical. And there was a fanatical element in the synagogue that wanted to kill Paul, apparently with a plot to, on the ship, engage him in a conversation late some night up on the deck and then push him overboard where he would be lost at sea in the Mediterranean. But he heard about this plot. And so instead of sailing with the tour group, he went a different route and went north back to Macedonia, although still with the ultimate intention of going to Jerusalem. There was a team of 8 that traveled with Paul. Apparently 7 of them went ahead to Troas across the Aegean Sea, and the 2 that traveled together were Paul and his personal physician and the historian Luke. And it's interesting, the word that he uses. In Acts 20, verse 6, we read that we sailed from Philippi after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. And so scholars refer to this as one of the we sections of Acts. That is, that Luke is not a historian who is distant gathering information and reporting it, but he is actually an eyewitness who is reporting what he saw. And he switches from he and they to we. There's fascinating detail in the Bible. For example, that it took them 5 days to cross the Aegean. That was an exceptionally long time. They must have had extremely strong headwinds. When the same people had come the other way from east to west, it had taken them only 2 days, so this more than doubled the time. But it's that level of accuracy confirmed by ancient documents and research that helps us to understand the credibility of the Bible as an ancient book. Why did Paul have 8 traveling companions? Well, partially because he didn't want to be alone, because he knew that Christianity is not about individuals who operate unilaterally, that we are in this together, and he wanted to be part of a team. The other reason is that the members of the team were coming from different churches where they had collected money, and he wanted them in partnership to not only carry the cash, but also represent the donors in giving this money to the poor. The names that are listed are specific. Sopater, the son of Pyrrhus from Berea. He was from the town of Berea and the church there, and beyond that, we know not a thing about him. Aristarchus, he was also a money carrier. We do know that he had been with Paul in Ephesus, and that when the mob couldn't find Paul, they grabbed Aristarchus, and he probably got out of there just by his skin, because that mob easily could have killed him. Then there was Secundus from Thessalonica. He had a Latin name, as many of these did, meaning that he did not come from Jewish background, but came from pagan Romanism. He helped carry the money from the church in Thessalonica. Then there was Gaius from Derbe. He also had been picked up by the mob in Ephesus. His life had also been at risk, and now he's carrying the cash that came from the church in Derbe. Timothy, he was Paul's traveling companion, and later in the story became the pastor of the church in Ephesus. Tychicus, he was from the province of Asia, and perhaps from the church in Ephesus. If that's so, it is fascinating, because that is to say that the Christians in Ephesus, who were very new believers, apparently took an offering for poor people. So early in their Christian faith, they demonstrated this generosity. Tychicus also shows up later on in the New Testament because Paul wrote a series of letters that were delivered to the churches that he had founded. And it turns out that Tychicus was his FedEx man who delivered these letters to churches in Colossae and elsewhere. Last on the list is Trophimus, which is another Latin name. We know relatively little about him, but I will forewarn you that his story shows up again a little bit later in Acts 21, when he is also the center of a riot that just about takes his life. And that riot occurs in the city of Jerusalem. Now, why all these names? Names that in high probability very few, if any of us, will remember after we walk out of this room today. Why these names? Because they're the ones who changed the world for Jesus Christ. It wasn't just people with saint in front of their name, like Paul. In fact, he could not have done it alone. It was others that we are unfamiliar with who were passionately committed to Jesus, who left their homes and their jobs, at least for a short term, who gave their money to help the poor, who spoke words in order to communicate the gospel and the truth of Jesus. They gave of themselves, and they changed their generation for Jesus Christ. They were committed to one another, to Jesus Christ, to the church, to evangelism, and to social action. And that's us. Most of the people in the world do not know our names. None of us are really famous. And yet we're the ones who are changing our generation. So if the Bible were being written today, and perhaps it is somewhere in a library in heaven for us in the future to read, it will be our names that are recorded. Now, intuitively, I think that we are all prone to say, not my name. There's no way, because all I do is live life. I get up in the morning, I take a shower and get dressed, and I go to work, and I drive home, and I pay bills, and I eat meals, and I talk to my neighbors, and I go to bed at night and repeat the whole same routine the next day. So I don't really do that much. But that is precisely what these people on this list would have said. I mean, all we're doing is carrying some money contributed by a group of people on a trip, and then going back home, going back to work, and sleeping in the same bed. And it's not that we really do that much, but it is precisely in living out Christian faith on a day-to-day basis that whole generations are transformed. Those then and us now, we are the ones who live for Jesus, who care about the poor, who spread the gospel, who live out Christianity. Let's add one other piece of information. The rest of the New Testament is made up of letters. So there are the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the history of how the church changed the world in Acts, and the rest of the New Testament, the rest of the Bible, is all letters. And many of those letters were written during the same time period that the book of Acts reports. So there is a sense in which we could study through Acts and interject each of the books of the New Testament in the time chronology. And what they are about is what was happening in the book of Acts. So, for example, a letter was written to the church in Corinth, and here's what that letter says in 1 Corinthians 16, St. Paul writing. Now, about the collection for God's people. Do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable for me to go also, they will accompany me. So this collection for the poor and what Paul led and wrote inaugurated the Christian practice of offerings when Christians gather on Sundays, a practice that has been continued for almost 2,000 years, that everybody contributes so that we can benefit and bless others. Now, it is especially interesting that they gathered on the first day of the week because they came out of a Jewish tradition of worship on the Sabbath, which was the seventh day of the week. The seventh day because in the creation story, God created in 6 days, rested on the seventh day, and Jews thereafter kept the Sabbath. But Christians changed that to the first day of the week, Sunday, celebrating the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday. They were saying essentially that the resurrection was greater and more important than even the creation of the universe, and that Christians then gather on Sundays or on Saturday night, as some churches do, which actually raises a bit of a problem for Wooddale Church because we have a service on Saturday night. But let me explain that for Jews, the day begins with sunset. So a day, like Sunday, is from sunset Saturday to sunset on Sunday. And at least during the winter months, the Saturday night service is therefore on Sunday. But then we have the gathering at 7 o'clock on Sunday night, which by the Jewish reckoning actually means that it's on Monday. But let me explain that the Romans counted a day from midnight to midnight. So the gathering by Roman reckoning is definitely on Sunday. And the bottom line of all this is that what matters most is not the time, but the who, that we come to worship. That it's about worshiping God, not the time schedule. Paul and the group were in Troas for only a week, but they went to church on Sunday, on the first day of the week. The report of that service is a little strange, but it does give an unusual insight, a very unusual insight, into first century church services. So Acts 20 continues. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where they were meeting. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him. Don't be alarmed, as if they wouldn't be alarmed. He said, he's alive. Then he went upstairs again and broke bread and ate. After talking until daylight, he left. The people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. Now, there are some Christians who insist that the church in the 21st century must do everything precisely as it was done in the first century. And if that's so, that means that all of our services should be by candlelight, and the typical sermon should be somewhere around 10 to 14 hours in length. And that's probably not going to happen. We're going to try it this morning. No, we're not. But the only two essential ingredients in this worship service in Acts 20 were the sermon and the sacrament. That is, the teaching of God's Word and Christian communion. In the first century, Christians often gathered together for a meal. In Sweden, it would be called a smorgasbord. In America, it would be called a potluck. They called it a love feast. And people would bring food, and at the end, they would celebrate communion together. It was social, and it was spiritual. Sermons were not typically this long. Paul was there for a short visit, and he needed to get a year's worth of teaching into a single day. There is no mention of worship or music in the service they had. In all probability, that was part of the service. However, I think that we would be unfamiliar with both their worship and their music, as they would probably be very unfamiliar with our worship and our music. The point is that it is God that we worship, and there's a multitude of different cultural contexts and ways for God to be worshiped. And then there's the story of Eutychus, this teenager who fell asleep in church and died, and thereby learned his lesson. He is the first in a tired train of stories about people falling asleep in church. Now, I keep track of things like this, and what I have observed is that people fall asleep in movies and at sports events. They fall asleep in physicians' offices. Some people fall asleep driving the car, watching television, and so we shouldn't be surprised if people fall asleep in church as well. A pastor friend of mine told the story about a suburban Los Angeles church where the center aisle did not have what our center aisles have, and that is end caps. And there was a man who fell asleep sitting on the center aisle, and as he slept, he tilted. And eventually, he went over right into the center aisle during the service. And they had an usher who was alert and decisive, and immediately ran and began mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and chest compressions, which I am sure taught that man to never fall asleep in church again. So, like Eutychus, he learned his lesson. In the Roman Empire, half or more of the population were slaves. So there's a majority possibility that Eutychus was a slave, a teenager, who had worked a long day, and as a Christian came to church and was in a room where they were burning lamps, so the oxygen was in shorter supply. They didn't have windows as we have windows. They had doors that went down to the floor and often up to the ceiling, and it was open so that fresh air could come in, and Eutychus had found a seat so that he could get that air, and he was simply tired as the service went late into the night, and he fell asleep and went out the window, tumbled down, and died. And the people rushed to his side, and St. Paul did as well, and he took a page out of the Old Testament book of 1 Kings, chapter 17. Where there is a story about the prophet Elisha staying in the home of a widow whose son died. And Elisha prayed for God's supernatural intervention, spread his body over that child, who then came back to life again. In both cases, it was an amazing and very unusual miracle. And then they resumed the church service, and Paul went back to preaching. And I am sure everyone stayed awake for the rest of that service. But the lesson for us is not about staying awake in church or falling out a window. The lesson is that Christians gather together in community, that the church is where we learn about God. The church is where we meet other Christians and share in communion. The church is where we face life and death together. The church is where we pool our resources in order to help those who have special needs. The church is our spiritual schoolhouse, our community, and our family. It was in Troas, and it is for us in the 21st century. If we were not reading and studying through the New Testament book of Acts, we probably never would have picked this piece of the Bible for today. But I'm glad that we did, because it's as much about changing the world for Jesus Christ as anything else that's written in the Bible. It is that individually we are people of faith who live out in everyday life Jesus Christ. And that as Christians, we are never alone, that we are together in community. And in community, we share exhilarating highs and frightening depths. that we're about life and death and the good times and the bad times, and we are about sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we are about worship and learning, and we are about generously giving in order to help others. Together, we change our world for Jesus Christ. God, help us in our generation to live out our Christian faith in the ordinary things we do as ordinary people, and help us together as the Church of Jesus Christ to change our world for our Savior. Amen.